I still remember the day I got the text. My thumb hovered over the screen for a long moment, staring at her name in the group chat. Holiday dinner at Sarah's. Hope you can make it. Sarah, our mutual friend. Someone who'd been the thread holding so many of our shared lives together for years. And now, somehow, she had invited him, my ex-husband, and his new companion, the woman who had inserted herself into our marriage like a wedge, like a virus. Before I even think about tonight, I need to remind myself of the story that led here. We'd been married for almost 12 years. 12 years of shared mornings, late-night arguments, quiet reconciliations, and those moments of laughter that felt like they could last forever. At least they used to. He was charming in the way that made people believe in him instantly. I loved that charm once. It was in the way he smiled at me across a crowded room. The way he listened. Really listened to my rants and dreams. But somewhere along the line, he began looking elsewhere. First at work, then at a mutual friend, and eventually, full-blown betrayal. I don't even remember the first day I knew. Maybe it was the way he started shutting doors behind him. The way I could feel him slipping away before he even said a word. And then there was her. I don't even want to say her name, because she shouldn't matter. And yet here she was, flaunting herself in the circles we shared. She was everything I wasn't. Young, glossy, laughing with a confidence that made you wince, always dressed like she knew she owned the world. And apparently, she owned my ex too. Yet despite all of that, despite the betrayal, there was a part of me that wanted to see this dinner through. Not because I missed him, never that, but because I needed to measure the battlefield, to watch the play unfold, to see how fragile this triumphant little display really was. I started preparing that morning, not obsessively, but deliberately. I didn't want to be flashy. I didn't want to wear anything that would scream attention. I wanted calm, controlled, subtle, unassuming even. Because tonight, the power wasn't in charm or clothes. The power would be in precision. Arriving at Sarah's apartment, the familiar smell of pine garlands and cinnamon hit me first, softening the tight knot in my stomach. The door opened before I could knock, and there he was. Taller than I remembered, posture perfect, the kind of confident stance that could make someone forget they'd ever known vulnerability. And there she was beside him, bright-eyed, laughing at some private joke, her hand lightly brushing his arm. They didn't notice me at first, which was perfect. I let them linger in their little bubble of triumph, savoring the scene silently. I waved to Sarah, hugged a few familiar faces, and then casually made my way into the living room, just close enough to see, far enough to remain unobtrusive. And that's when it began. The parade of smiles and forced conversations. The small displays of superiority he clearly intended to perform. He introduced her around like she was the star of the evening, which apparently in his mind, she was. I nodded politely at their little introductions, offered smiles, but inside I catalogued everything. The way he looked at her, the way she mirrored his every movement, the little smirks when others commented on their perfect pairing. I made a mental note of the people in the room, those who knew the truth, those who suspected, and those blissfully ignorant. Every detail mattered. Every small interaction could be leveraged later, and I knew it would. A part of me felt that familiar twist of satisfaction, the kind that comes not from acting, but from waiting. watching silently the seed of arrogance begin to show cracks, knowing that this carefully curated image of theirs could be undone, and that tonight I would be the one holding the tools. As I sipped my wine, I let my eyes wander across the room, observing every small gesture, the way he laughed too loudly, the way she leaned in for validation, the subtle micro-expressions that betrayed the rehearsed perfection of their act. And I realized it was all smoke and mirrors, fragile, artificial, and I was about to pull the curtain. The evening stretched on, polite chatter and holiday greetings filling the air. But every second was a quiet countdown. Every toast, every compliment, every laugh they shared was a thread that I would soon tug at, unraveling the narrative they thought was theirs. Tonight wasn't about anger. It wasn't about yelling or confrontation. It was about subtlety, patience, and watching the truth rise slowly, invisibly. Like a tide no one could stop. I let a small, satisfied smile touch my lips. I wasn't here for them to see me. I was here for the story to unfold. And oh, it would unfold. Walking into the living room again, I felt the familiar knot tighten in my stomach. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger. It was anticipation. That sharp thrill that comes with knowing you're about to play a game where everyone thinks they hold the cards. Except you. He looked up the moment I entered, a flash of recognition crossing his face, quickly replaced by a practiced smile. "You came," he said, voice smooth, almost too casual. His arm brushed hers as he introduced me, and I noticed the micro flicker in her expression. Annoyance. Maybe even a little panic. Perfect. "I wouldn't miss it," I replied lightly, letting my voice carry just enough warmth to be polite, yet holding a subtle edge. I smiled at the group of mutual friends gathered near the table, feeling the familiar sting of shared history in every glance. This was my stage, my audience, and soon enough, my quiet little performance would begin. The room hummed with polite chatter, the clink of glasses, the laughter that was just a little too loud. I made small talk, answered questions with measured calm, and let my eyes occasionally drift to them. Observing, calculating. "She's wonderful," he said at one point, loudly enough for the circle around us to hear. "Isn't she, everyone?" His grin was triumphant, the kind that comes from believing everyone is on his side, that his world is perfectly constructed. I nodded politely. "She's lovely," I said. "I imagine she has a lot of qualities you admire." My tone was airy, almost innocent, but inside I was savoring the subtle jab. He didn't miss it. His smile flickered for just a second, a tiny crack in his armor, and I made a mental note to remember that. Throughout the early part of the dinner, I let them bask in the illusion. He was confident. She was radiant. Everyone else was politely complicit. And yet, with every passing moment, the tension tightened like a string pulled taut. I could sense it, and it gave me patience, a sense of control. Later, when the appetizers arrived, I found myself seated across from him, directly in view of the small circle that had once been ours. And that was when the first opportunity appeared. He began recounting a story from a mutual trip, embellishing details, inserting her into every moment as if she'd always been a part of it. My eyes narrowed and I waited for the perfect opening. "Oh, I remember that day," I interjected softly, smiling just enough to be polite. "It's funny though. I remember it quite differently. Funny how memories can shift, isn't it? My words were casual, almost conversational. but there was a quiet undertone of challenge. The group looked at me, some curious, some cautious. He blinked. She stiffened. "Oh? How so?" he asked, his voice slightly too loud, betraying irritation. "Well," I continued, letting a subtle pause stretch long enough to draw attention. "I remember that we had a minor disagreement about the itinerary. And actually, it wasn't you who suggested the final plan. It was me." I let my words hang, watching as a few friends shifted uncomfortably, realizing they might have misremembered who had been in control back then. The tension was delicious. He tried to mask his irritation, redirecting the conversation, but the seed had been planted. Subtle, harmless to the casual observer. But I knew it would ripple through the room, quietly undermining the pedestal he'd built for himself. As dinner progressed, I noticed the small microsigns. A slightly forced laugh from him, a glance exchanged between her and another friend that didn't meet his eye, the faint tightening of his jaw. Every small cue fed me satisfaction. The first cracks were appearing, and I hadn't even begun in earnest. Later, during the toast, he raised his glass again, clearly intending to reclaim the room. But I met his gaze calmly, holding his look just long enough to remind him I was present, unshaken and watching. "To old friends and new memories," he said, his tone a little too grand. I raised my glass just slightly, offering a polite smile. "To honesty and remembering who we truly are," I added softly, almost like an afterthought. A few heads turned toward me, some ears perked up, and I felt a small thrill. The first real tremor of subtle disruption. It wasn't dramatic yet. No one had been embarrassed. No one had been exposed. But the balance had shifted, ever so slightly. And that was the key. Subtlety. Watching them unravel quietly, letting the truth whisper in the background, slowly making them doubt themselves and each other. By the end of Act 2, the holiday dinner felt like a chessboard, with each small interaction, glance, and carefully chosen word moving the pieces. He thought he was in control. She thought the evening was hers to shine. But in reality, the game had already begun, and I was several moves ahead. By the time dessert arrived, the room had settled into a strange rhythm. Laughter, polite chatter, the occasional clink of silverware. On the surface, everything seemed normal, but I could feel the undercurrent, that invisible tension weaving through the room like a live wire. He had been carefully performing all evening, that charming, self-assured act he always relied on. But with every glance, every quiet comment from me, the cracks were growing. And she, bless her, had no idea how delicate her pedestal had become. It started small, a misremembered story, I corrected gently. "Actually, I think it was more like this," I said, voice soft, eyes warm, a smile just teasing enough to disarm him. He laughed nervously, trying to reclaim dominance, but I could see it. The first flicker of doubt. His rehearsed confidence wavered. She tried to jump in, eager to rescue him, but in doing so, she overcompensated. A small misstep here, a flustered correction there. I made a note. Everyone at the table was still smiling politely, none realizing how fragile the image had become. But I did. That was enough. Later, a toast. He stood, glass raised, clearly intending to draw everyone's attention back to himself. I waited, letting the pause stretch just long enough for the room to notice my quiet presence. "To friendships, love, and happy memories," he said, voice booming. I raised my glass too and added softly, almost conversationally, and to remember in the truth behind those memories. The room paused, almost imperceptibly, but perceptibly enough for a few glances to shift in my direction. His smirk faltered for the first time that night. She froze, trying to figure out if my comment was an attack, a joke, or something else entirely. The seed of doubt had been planted, and I could feel it beginning to grow. Small moments continued to unfold. He tried to control the conversation, but my interjections, perfectly timed, carefully worded, kept shifting attention. A laugh here, a memory there, a gentle, pointed reminder of shared experiences that didn't include her. I wasn't being cruel, I was being precise, subtle, surgical. At one point, she tried to corner me in the kitchen, whispering compliments that were thinly veiled attempts to gain my favor. I smiled, polite, and said only, "Thanks." I've always preferred honesty over flattery. The corners of her mouth twitched, and I knew I'd scored another point. By the time the coffee came around, the air had changed. He was still charming, still performing, but the mask was slipping. You could see it in the slight twitch of his jaw, the way he glanced at me when he thought no one else was watching. And her. She was beginning to realize that her spotlight wasn't as secure as she'd believed. That was the moment I knew. The first real spark of my revenge had been lit. Nothing dramatic, no public humiliation yet. Just subtle creeping doubt. But like all sparks, if nurtured, it could turn into a blaze. I leaned back in my chair, smiling slightly, as I watched them navigate the evening. Every laugh they forced, every story they exaggerated, every glance they exchanged now carried a tension they couldn't quite name. And I was calm, composed, and utterly satisfied, because this was just the beginning. The first cracks were showing, and soon their carefully constructed image would crumble completely. And I would be there, quietly observing, savoring each moment as their world began to unravel from within. The night had reached that delicate point. Everyone had eaten. The chatter was flowing, but beneath it, tension hummed like electricity. I could feel it, and I knew the moment had come to push things just slightly further. I waited until he was mid-story, embellishing some minor accomplishment of his, eyes gleaming with self-satisfaction. She sat beside him, laughing in all the right places, nodding, touching his arm as though she owned the room. Perfect. All the more satisfying to unravel, I interjected casually, voice soft, friendly, disarming. "Oh, I think that version of the story leaves out a few details," I said. Heads turned. "Remember when we had the argument about the schedule? You insisted on the itinerary, but actually it was me who had final say. Funny how memories shift." Pause. A few raised eyebrows. His smile faltered. Just a flicker, but I noticed. She looked at me sharply, an almost imperceptible narrowing of her eyes. That tiny crack was enough to let the subtle work begin. From that moment, every comment, every anecdote, every shared memory became a weapon. I remembered small moments from our marriage, little details no one else could verify, and I let them slip naturally into conversation. Not maliciously, just casually, as if they were the most ordinary parts of life. But each one chipped away at the narrative, quietly eroding the pedestal he had built for himself. When he boasted about a recent project at work, I smiled and said, "Oh, that reminds me. I remember you struggling with the initial draft. You almost asked for help a few times, didn't you?" The laughter around the table wavered. A few friends shifted uncomfortably. His eyes darted to her, searching for backup. She didn't know what to do. The spotlight was slipping. Then came the small, subtle exposure. In telling a story about a mutual friend's recent engagement, I mentioned, almost casually, the same friend had confided in me months ago about how he had treated her during her wedding preparations. Little lies, exaggerations, half-truths. The friend's discomfort became visible, their eyes flicking nervously between him and me. A faint gasp, polite, understated, but enough. Enough for the room to start questioning the image he had projected. By now, he was visibly on edge, a hand rubbing the back of his neck, a small twitch at his lip. She, sensing the shift, tried to regain control, interrupting, correcting, laughing a bit too loudly at a joke he didn't make. But the cracks were deepening. She was no longer in harmony with him. Her composure was beginning to crumble under the quiet pressure I applied. I leaned back in my chair, watching, serene, letting my calm demeanor contrast sharply with their unease. Every time he attempted a witty remark, I responded with mild, pointed reminders of things he had forgotten, misrepresented, or tried to gloss over. Each correction, each gentle nudge, seemed innocent to the casual observer. But for him, it was like sand slipping through his fingers. The final moment came when someone mentioned the holiday gift exchange. I smiled, recalling the story of a past misunderstanding during a previous gift swap, and mentioned it lightly. Funny how things are remembered differently. Some people have a way of exaggerating generosity, don't they? The room fell into a brief, uncomfortable silence. All eyes flicked to him. He coughed nervously. She swallowed hard. I didn't have to say more. The point had landed. The subtle seed of doubt, the quiet unraveling of confidence, had been planted. And I knew the rest would unfold naturally. No shouting, no confrontation. Just the gentle collapse of their perfect little act, observed with measured calm. By the end of the night, as the last glasses were emptied and people began to drift toward coats and goodbyes, the tension had shifted completely. He walked out first, stiff, fumbling with his jacket. She followed, equally pale and uncertain. The carefully constructed image they had carried into the evening was fractured. And I? I stayed behind, sipping the last of my wine, smiling faintly, savoring the quiet victory. The revenge wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't need to be. Subtlety had done its work, and the fallout would continue long after the door closed. I realized, in that calm after the storm, that this kind of revenge, patient, clever, quietly cruel, was far more satisfying than any outburst or public confrontation could ever be. The house was quiet the next day, but the ripples of last night's dinner hadn't even begun to settle. Messages had already started popping up. Indirect texts, subtle comments in group chats, muted expressions at work. I wasn't looking for confirmation. I could feel it. The subtle unraveling I had orchestrated was working its way outward. He had called me that morning. Well, attempted to. The first 3 calls went straight to voicemail. I let them. Let them build. Let the frustration simmer. By the 4th call, I finally picked up, voice calm, measured, like nothing had changed. "Hello," I said casual, sipping my coffee. "Can we talk?" His voice was low, hesitant. That hesitation was a treat, a tiny morsel of satisfaction. He had been confident, untouchable, but now even speaking to me required courage. "I think everything was said last night," I replied, tone soft, but with a quiet authority. "The rest, well, People will remember in their own way. I didn't give him an opening. I didn't have to. I could hear him falter, the words he wanted to say stumbling over each other in his mouth. Finally he sighed, a long, defeated sound, and hung up. I smiled. I didn't need to gloat. The work was already done. At work, I started noticing changes too. Mutual friends who had once nodded along with his every story now asked questions, made clarifying remarks, and subtly reminded him of details he had tried to bury. She, his companion, began appearing less often, her confidence visibly shaken when I entered a room. The subtle cracks I'd planted at dinner were rippling outward, quietly exposing the facade he had built. Yet, as satisfying as it was, the aftermath wasn't entirely clean. A few friends looked at me differently, some curious, some cautious. Some whispered, wondering if I had overstepped. I wasn't naive. I knew there would be consequences. Quiet, subtle social tension. That's the price of winning a clever game. But the knowledge that my dignity and composure remained intact, that I had reclaimed a sense of control I had lost for so long, was worth it. A week later, I ran into one of our mutual friends at the coffee shop. She hesitated before speaking, clearly weighing her words. I think you handled last week brilliantly, she said, careful, quiet. Well, he's been a little off since then. I smiled faintly. Sometimes people just need a reminder of reality, I said, keeping my tone soft but firm. No need to elaborate. The subtlety of it all made it far more effective than any confrontation ever could. There were moments of quiet reflection afterward. Lying in bed, recalling the way he had laughed, the way she had tried to rescue him, and the small, perfect victories I'd collected throughout the evening. I didn't feel triumphant in the traditional sense. It wasn't about humiliating them in front of everyone or shouting at their faces. It was about patience, observation, and precision. About letting them see, slowly, quietly, that their pedestal was hollow. And yet, the world wasn't neat. Life didn't hand out perfect justice in bright cinematic finales. There were lingering tensions, uncomfortable social interactions, the occasional awkward glance from someone who knew what had happened but didn't want to comment. But I could live with that. I could carry that satisfaction quietly, because the personal victory, my calm reclamation of power and composure, was mine alone. Sometimes revenge isn't about shouting, it's about subtlety. It's about knowing your worth and refusing to let someone else redefine it. It's about planting seeds of truth in ways that grow without you having to force them. And for me, last night was a reminder of that. I let myself smile at the memory, sipping the last of my tea. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't clean, but it was real, messy, understated, and satisfying in its quiet precision. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that sometimes the most potent victories are the ones that unfold slowly, without anyone noticing until the moment is right. And when that moment comes, the ripple effects are far more powerful than any dramatic confrontation ever could be. So, yes, I got my revenge, but I also got something more valuable. The quiet knowledge that I hadn't lost myself, that I hadn't allowed the past to define me, and that I had reclaimed a sense of control, not loudly, not explosively, but cleverly, subtly, and completely. That's the story of the holiday dinner, the ex and the companion who thought they could flaunt their triumph without consequence. It wasn't loud, it wasn't public, but it was effective. Sometimes revenge doesn't need fire and fury. Sometimes it's quiet, clever, and precise, and that makes it all the sweeter. If you've ever faced someone flaunting betrayal and found a way to turn the tables subtly, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next Tales of Revenge story. Remember, patience, observation, and subtlety are sometimes the sharpest weapons we have.